Hey there, SHIRO listeners. SaturnDave here, reminding you that you must play Sega Saturn, and that it's contributions from listeners like you that help keep this and our other shows hosted and available on demand, in addition to our website, SegaSaturnShiro.com, where you can find all of the most up-to-date news and information from around the Sega Saturn scene. If you'd like to show your support and gain access to several perks, visit patreon.com/SHIRO Media Group to become a Patreon supporter. If a monthly donation isn't possible, no worries. We still value your support in liking and sharing our content on social media and joining our Discord community to become a part of the Saturn conversation. Thank you for being a loyal listener and a part of this great community. And as always, Hey everybody, this is SaturnDave. Welcome to Editor's Corner, and tonight I have a couple guests with me. I got Mel, Sega Lord X. How you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great, man.
Awesome. And Dan, the MegaDriver, my fellow SHIRO. How you doing, Dan?
I'm doing great, Dave. How are you doing?
I'm doing excellent. We have a topic that I'm really interested in getting you all's insight on, and we're going to be talking about the ways that Sega changed, from the fourth generation, like entering the fourth generation up through the sixth generation and beyond. Actually, we can kind of tag on to like where they are now. This is a topic that I started thinking about back when Mel went on record saying that Sega was kind of like both Jekyll and Hyde. You described them as like Jekyll and Hyde, kind of two faces, not quite knowing who they are as a company and flip-flopping quite a bit, both to their success and to their detriment. And I think one thing you could say that is consistent about Sega is just the fact that they never quite knew who they were. They had like an identity crisis, so I kind of want to talk about that and explore some of the characteristics they had as a company and a games maker during the Genesis, Mega Drive, and then the Saturn, and then the Dreamcast, and kind of where they ended up today. So to kick it off, I wanted to start with Mel and just have you paint us a picture of what kind of company you think Sega was entering the fourth generation with the Genesis.
Well, Sega was coming into the Genesis. Their success with the Master System had sort of been all over the place, wasn't it? It was, in places around Europe, they did well with the Master System, but in Japan and in North America, they didn't do well at all. And, we come into the Genesis era, and you really saw that with the Genesis, because many of the properties that Sega had success with on the Master System, they didn't really carry over to the Genesis. Not a lot, and definitely not long term. Pretty much the only things they held on to was, really, breakout hits like Shinobi. I mean, even something like Alex Kidd pretty much disappeared on the Mega Drive really quickly. There wasn't a continuous sustained series there anymore. And, I found going back and kind of looking at Sega, the big picture, I found that this occurred every single console generation for Sega from that point forward. It was almost like they redefined themselves to the point where any success that they had the previous generation was almost forgotten. The following generation, they completely changed in terms of the types of games that they made or the types of IPs that would go on and continue. And I mean, it happened continually with properties that just sold incredibly well. I mean, you can look at the obvious things, like there wasn't a Sonic on the Sega Saturn when it launched. What happened to the Streets of Rage series? Why did that just disappear? And, it's easy to sort of dismiss some of these games because, say, something like Streets of Rage, fighting games didn't really expand during the 32-bit generation. But even when you look at that on the surface, like, why didn't Sega evolve Streets of Rage to become multi-genre or something? I mean, why wasn't anything tried to continue these IPs that had helped define its hardware platforms previously? And
Were they just being overly cautious? Were they kind of like tiptoeing around their market demographic and kind of like unsure of themselves?
I honestly think that there is something to that because, as you know, Sega didn't really have any type of worldwide success ever. If you go back and look at the 8-bit generation, 16-bit generation, 32-bit generation, so on and so forth, somewhere in the world Sega did terribly and somewhere they did well. So I think it was sort of that that mix matching of it did well in Japan this generation, it failed in Japan the next generation. It did well in Europe this generation, it didn't do well in Europe the following generation. When you break it down like that, I think that gave Sega a lot of doubt and a lot of pause with its IPs. But even then, when you think about that, you still can't explain why the hell there's a side-scrolling platformer on the Saturn at the North American launch, and it's not Sonic the Hedgehog. For the love of God, who at Sega greenlit Clockwork Knight and said, let's put this on the system and not Sonic? It's not like Clockwork Knight did something new. It was a traditional action side-scrolling 2D platformer.
Okay, that's a ton to unpack, but actually I have some thoughts on this. So
shoot it, man. I'd love to hear this.
Okay, so first of all, let me play devil's advocate for just a second, and I want Dan's opinion on this too. But so, Sega's got this thing where they flip-flop, right? And that's the one consistent thing about them, is that they're always just changing, like you said. Now, I wonder how much of the Sonic thing and everything was like the West's influence, okay? So like, for example, Tom Kalinske comes in. I'm not pinning any specific blame on Tom, but I'm just saying the West comes in and they don't make games, right? They just know how to sell shit, right? In fact, for the bulk of their history, the folks in the West are always just sitting there like, gimme. What else good do you have, right? And they're just literally sitting on their hands like there's nothing they can do. They have to wait for Japan to make all the cool stuff so that they can, I can sell this. Let's give it away for free, or whatever. They have some kind of harebrained schemes to sell the stuff, but they're not making this stuff. So they're sitting there going, please give us another Sonic game, right? But of course, you get the folks who actually have the power, who are like making stuff, going, well, we don't want to make Sonic games anymore because we're artists, or we're creative. We want to do something different, right?
So it's when you're talking about the identity, I think there's two sides, isn't there? I mean, there's the games, which I think, Mel, you covered really, really well there. And I think there's also kind of the marketing identity. So just coming back to your point, Dave, just around, did they want to try new things, or what stopped them? I think if you take the Clockwork Knight or the Saturn era Sonic issue, they were obviously infamously looking to make Bug a Sonic game, or at least Real Time were looking to make Bug a Sonic game, and then Sega it seemed like they were far too protective of that IP at the time, and they kind of vetoed it, didn't they? So I think there's probably a variety of things at play there, because if they are protective of an IP, if they have got an IP that's done well in a region, it may be that they don't want to, sully that IP and put it on an inferior product. We saw it with, the whole debacle with Sonic Extreme, when that was obviously in development hell and that wasn't looking great. So I think there's a number of factors there, but it definitely is something that Sega did. And I think in both terms, in both the facts of the games that they made and in their marketing identity, they did seem to flip-flop around a lot and didn't seem to know who they were. But I would say very, very UK or maybe European-centric. That wasn't so much the case coming from Master System to MegaDrive over here, where the Master System had a significant foothold. Because a lot of the attitude that we saw in the MegaDrive's marketing over in the UK was actually carried over from the Master System. In the Master System, I don't know if either of you two have ever seen those print ads that they used to put in like adult magazines, where people are holding a joystick, and it's like the more you play with it, the harder it gets, and all that sort of stuff.
Oh yeah.
So they had all that. They had all that attitude, And even down to the games, and I know that we got a lot more Master System games in the West, because we'd see the occasional thing. We had Alex Kidd was a big thing on the Master System, and then we'd get Alex Kidd and the Enchanted Castle, and that would be it. We'd get Fantasy Zone. Obviously, that's an arcade game, and we get Super Fantasy Zone on the Mega Drive. And I've got memories of opening up my game boxes, Master System and Mega Drive, putting open the flyers in there with the poster on the other side, and you'd have like the game catalog on the inside, and you could kind of join the dots between the two. So in that sense, for us, and because games like Streets of Rage, Sonic the Hedgehog, and games that were stalwarts on the Mega Drive actually came over to the Master System, it did feel like more of an evolution there, and it wasn't as stark as kind of the jump from 16 to 32-bit, where it almost seemed to be, throw the baby out with the bathwater and let's completely start again, despite the success that we've had in the West, which was insane. And yeah, if you look back, even when the Genesis launched, you had iconic games like Space Harrier, Thunderblade. You had, in that launch window, I think you had Golden Axe. I think it was a launch game over here in the West.
Right.
It was all very much recognizable IP. But the Saturn, aside from Virtua Fighter, we didn't have that many recognizable IPs when the Sega Saturn launched, was that because Sega were trying to do something different? Is that because they were relying on their arcade hits that were coming down the pipe later on, or there could be a million reasons?
So one consistent thread is that Sega is an arcade amusement company, and we can see that through Master System, Genesis, Saturn. There is consistency in arcade ports. We see it on all those consoles. Now, the market and the interest in arcade ports changes, over time. But that one thing stays consistent with Sega. Master System, you mentioned Space Harrier and, some of the down ports of like super scalar games and stuff like that. Not that you didn't see like adventure games and like RPGs on the Master System, but with the Genesis, you actually start to see more like full-fledged adventures, Castle of Illusion, the Phantasy Star series continues to grow. You've got a bunch of other like licensed games, but essentially a lot of arcade conversions, on the Genesis, and you've got a lot of acquired licensed sports on the Genesis. Sports were big. Mel's mentioned this several times, that sports were kind of weak on the Saturn, not nearly as well represented as on the Genesis, because that was like a huge selling point in America, and they were always just kind of late to the game with the Saturn because they just couldn't get those licenses. It was just difficulties importing, difficulties with the hardware or whatnot. But you could see that the interest was still there. Like internally, from what we've seen in hindsight, is that Sega of America were struggling and saying like, when will we have this ready? Right. So it was like they wanted to continue that tradition of sports games and stuff like that, but they were kind of beholden to what they had available in terms of third-party support, and then whatever cool stuff Sega of Japan was cooking, which they were able to see in glimpses, Yeah, they had the Tiger teams that they tried to throw together early on, to put some games together for launch, but you had stuff like Gen War, basically, and you had stuff like Bug, which, I like Bug. I think it's charming, but at the same time, Bug and Clockwork Knight, those, I'll admit, are acquired tastes, and even then, how well have they aged, So people knew back then that they didn't have the same kind of attitude as Sonic. They didn't have the kind of performance as Sonic, and then by comparison, Sony came out swinging, with attitude and style and, the whole club scene and everything like that. And the end was written on the wall. But as a company, though, did Sega change that much? And in what ways did they change? So like, let's just talk about the games so we can kind of keep things simple. What kind of games maker was Sega during the Genesis era?
Well, in the early days with the Genesis in North America, I think, Dan is actually pretty accurate, is that first year, Sega sort of tried to continue that arcade-centric flow of games, that had been on the Master System. They tried to continue it on the Genesis. Very early in those days, that's where you got the Alex Kidd game on the Genesis and Mega Drive. You got Space Harrier 2, you got a Thunderblade, you got these games that very much were Sega's identity. Sega was an arcade company. So that's what Sega made. They made arcade style games. And a lot of those IPs transferred from arcade to Master System to Genesis. But then in year 2 of the Genesis, you started to see something very different happen. You started to see Sega pivot because Sega started to recognize that the games that it sold in the arcade were not going to be the same games that sold at home. And I believe this is why the Sega Genesis and Mega Drive is its lone worldwide success, because Sega recognized this. They saw that, wow, sports games have a real appeal. Let's start making sports games really heavily. And the next thing you know, the Genesis is known as the sports system to a ton of people. And the next thing you know, it explodes because of that popularity. A lot of people want to give Sonic credit on the Genesis as being that powder keg that lit that system off.
Right.
And it really was, when you look at it, as far as when did its biggest spike in sales happen.
That's their Mickey Mouse.
Right. But what happened is that year leading up to Sonic, the Genesis was seeing a sort of a redefining of its market position, because Electronic Arts had come out with John Madden Football, that first one, and it was garnering all this media praise, and all the people at my school were talking about it. They didn't even own a Genesis, and they were talking about it. Sega Sports had begun to expand. Joe Montana Football hit the market. People were talking about, Sega Sports leading up to that year. Sonic was just sort of like, that final push that made people go, wow, okay.
Oh yeah.
Let's go with the Genesis and see what's what. And I think that's why Sega had such, so much success, is because that home system, which never stopped getting arcade ports, mind you, that's the really important part, but it started to evolve into having more than just those arcade ports. And that's where I think Sega really started to expand. They broke free of that yoke of just being an arcade company. The Genesis just saw this mass explosion of different type of software that Sega started to do. You started to see Sega mess around with different styles of RPG, like Sword of Vermilion. You started to see them really reach a point where they were willing to try anything, new, to see if gamers grabbed onto it, to see if they appreciated it. Sega made different types of games in those following years for the Genesis. When you really think about it, it was sort of, in many ways, where systems like the Saturn and Dreamcast also saw this great expansion. Maybe not on the financial end of it in terms of sales success, but success in terms of software quality. Because if you go and you look at the Sega Saturn, you can point to Virtua Fighter being this incredible series that played great, and it came from the arcade. But when you look at a top 10 for a Sega Saturn, isn't it stuff like, Knights, Guardian Heroes, Panzer Dragoon? A lot of that stuff wasn't arcade centric.
True.
Because there's two markets there. You had a console market and you had an arcade market. And Sega was relying on that arcade market so much at times that I think when they relied on it too much, and when you go back and you look at the Genesis, when you go back and look at the Saturn, those early days, Virtua Fighter, Daytona, Sega Rally, we love these games, but you have to consider the average consumer. They were sitting there wondering, what the hell happened to the sports games? What the hell happened to Sonic? What the hell happened to Streets of Rage? Where were these games that defined Sega? Sega had this up and down flow of, let's make all this console centric stuff and get people interested, and then we're going to stop making it and start porting arcade games again.
It's interesting. It's like they had one foot in the arcade side and then one foot more or less competing with the the competition. What is Nintendo doing? What is Sony doing? It occurred to me while you were talking is that based on the company's position at any given time, it kind of affected what they were doing on the game front. For example, with the Genesis, they were on their way up. They were a scrappy company that was looking to overthrow the dominant force, which was Nintendo, right? And they were on their way up. They were certainly not a failure yet. They hadn't experienced failure. It was all success, and it was building success. With Saturn, now the tables have kind of turned and they've found themselves in an awkward position where they made some miscalculations and now they're trying to plug up the holes in the dam, right? And then with the Dreamcast, the name of the game is survival, and it's innovation and stuff like that, but it's also just survival, you know what I mean? So as a company, forgetting about the games for a second, like as a company, those are their different stages, I would say. It's like, success and overthrowing the competition and then finding themselves in an awkward position and realizing they made mistakes that they really can't correct, and then just trying to survive, but ultimately having to get like $493 million from Okawa on his deathbed just to be able to survive as a company. So, I mean, Dan, can you speak to that at all? Like, did the success and maybe that cockiness come through with some of the Genesis era stuff? How would you say that where they were in their position as a company informed like the games and the type of games that they made?
I'm not sure, and I think both of you are making fantastic points. And that makes me think, as much as we love Sega as this company, and what we love about Sega is a lot of the innovation that they brought to the industry, because they were a front leader in a lot of technology in a way that we play today. Mm-hmm. But when you look back at Sega throughout their console history, they are, more than anything else, I think, extremely reactionary, not so much proactive. You look at stuff like the arcade ports that came to to their consoles. First of all, you had Space Harrier and Super Thunderblade, the MegaDriver, I think, when it launched in Japan, which were kind of rushed to market. It's only later that when they had some time to settle in that they started making them kind of longer form games. And, they started looking at games outside the arcade sphere. And you had stuff like Golden Axe had the extra stage. You had Super Monaco GP, which had its enormous career mode. So they started really fleshing out these arcade experiences and making them a lot more home-centric, which really was something that they should have continued to do with everything else that came after. You said, Dave, what sort of game maker was Sega? They kind of made a bit of everything. And I always saw that, Streets of Rage felt like a reaction to the Super Nintendo getting Final Fight. Phantasy Star, I think, was pretty much a reaction to Final Fantasy. And because they didn't have these third parties that were able to pitch in and fill the library like Nintendo had at the time, because Nintendo had these exclusive licensing deals, they kind of had to fill in the blanks themselves. But I think where they go through these sort of phases, and again, the Sega Saturn, as you get into that era, is a console which, its whole development is extremely reactionary. We know that the development of it started way back in 1991 when, by all accounts, apparently it was initially conceived as a reaction to the Super Nintendo, and then it continued to evolve. The 32X was there because they were scared of the Atari Jaguar.
Right.
And then the Saturn hardware evolved again because they were reacting to the PlayStation. And when you think about the fact, you talk about the DNA from Sega Genesis or Mega Drive over to Sega Saturn. You don't have that many games. What you get are quite simple games. And I think the reason for that, initially at least, is because obviously Virtua Fighter was a huge hit in the arcade and they knew that they had to bring that home. But the other side of that is the fact that when you look back at when Sega finalized the Sega Saturn hardware to when Virtua Fighter released, I think they only really had 6 or 7 months to develop it from there. When I was doing the Virtual Fighter video that we did for the channel, they had it was just about half a year. And that doesn't leave any time for them to add any sort of content. And then Panda's Sega Rally video, when he's talking about they wanted to do the whole, WRC, but then obviously they managed to add some content. But at the end of the day, it's still mostly just the arcade content in there. And I think it was just Sega being reactionary and not having the time and essentially rushing a lot of this content through. Even stuff like Panzer Dragoon, which was developed for the home, they were eager to get that out for the launch window in Japan, and they just missed it, and it came a few months later. Obviously, it was a launch title in the West, so I think that's a factor in why we see some of this behaviour with them. And you couple the fact that they're rushing this software out to react to the market and try and scramble around, because the whole Saturn's life cycle is them reaction, trying to find a tinderbox, trying to react to something, trying to find something, but without the kind of the time and the resources in order to give us, say, a faithful Streets of Rage game that works on 32-bit, or a faithful Sonic game.
Yeah, so they went from visionary to reactionary. I like that. And I agree. I would have to agree with you. I think that they became more reactionary when more players entered the market. Like, for example, they knew what was at stake. They knew what was possible because they were the ones that took down Goliath, Nintendo, and then a year later you got 3DO and you've got Atari, and then you've got Sony now there's all these other competitors, and they're like, well, they could just come along and do the same thing we did, right? So now they become much more reactionary. And you're right, they're not making wise, cool-headed decisions. They're doing a lot of Hail Mary plays, really, that's a very interesting standpoint. I also keep feeling like, with the Saturn, obviously, and many videos have been made about how one mistake led to another mistake. So the kind of position that they were in with the Saturn, just because, SOA and SOJ were not a unified front, with the whole, one wanting to do 32X and one wanting to charge ahead with a new platform and kind of get it up and going early. It resulted in the early surprise launch and poor relationships with retailers and all that stuff. And really, a bunch of third parties kind of just saying, bye, see ya, we're going to go with the PlayStation, right? So now you've got a Sega of America who came into power with the Genesis, right? Because, they were brought in to sell this thing, right? The Japanese are always really good at making cool stuff, but they didn't necessarily know how to sell it, at least not to American consumers. They did an amazing job with Saturn and Sega Saturn SHIRO, but in my opinion, but the thing is that it's the Americans and Kolinsky and everything that knew how to sell this stuff. And essentially they got a bunch of power, maybe more than they deserved, with the Genesis. And then when the Saturn came around, they're just sitting around, right? I get that sense that they're just kind of waiting for Sega of Japan to ship them, new demos or new games that they can start to sell. And it's you even get the sense from Panda's doc that it's they're just yeah, just hurry up. Stamp it, put a label on it, and we'll ship it. 98%, that's fine. We need it out by Christmas so we can, sell extra copies and for the holidays. And so, that's a completely different company, attitude wise than they were during the Genesis era. That's two different companies, really. When I think about with the Genesis, that they had nothing but time because Nintendo was already on top. So it's not like there's a deadline. We need to take them down, and it's going to be the long game, and it's going to be calculated. Japan didn't like the Sonic giveaway thing, right? We all know that story. Japan didn't like that idea, but America thought it was a good idea, and it ended up actually working out pretty well for them. Like you said, Mel, it wasn't the only thing, but it was kind of the nail in the coffin, right? It was their Mario.
Yeah.
So once Genesis took the majority of the market share, once Sega took the majority of the market share away from Nintendo, and they were sitting pretty, it's I think they got a little too cocky. And they had a bunch of power, but they didn't actually make anything, so they were constantly bugging Sega of Japan to make cool stuff for us. A couple of the things that they were responsible for was pushing things like 32X, right? Which ended up proving not to be that great of an idea. So
I think that is the entire framing of this conversation is exactly what Dan said. Sega was a reactionary company. Where you really get into the nuance of it is, where were they successful with their reactions and where did they fail with their reactions? On the Genesis, I feel a lot of their reactions were accurate. They did need a response to Final Fight on the Super Nintendo. That gave us Streets of Rage. They did need a response to Mario. That ultimately led to the creation of Sonic. They did need a response to the, growing popularity of sports games on the Nintendo Entertainment System, which gave us Sega Sports eventually. Sega's reactions during the 16-bit era, many of them actually led to something that worked, and I think where things sort of went down in flames were after that. And I think that's where what you were just talking about. Basically, what happens is Sega gets to a point where it has to make all these brand new decisions for the Saturn that's coming out, and ultimately the Dreamcast. Mm-hmm. And then all of their reactions from that point were the worst way to go. It's kind of like, let's worry about the Atari Jaguar. I mean, it boggles my mind that a successful businessman could know Atari's operating income in 1993 and worry about that console. That mm-hmm. company never had the money to create any software mm-hmm. for itself. Why were you worried about the Atari Jaguar? Anybody that had any knowledge of the business, and these guys were entrenched in the console business, why were they even worried about something like the 3DO? The 3DO was a $700 console. It was Neo Geo class. It was the Maserati of the console world. You didn't ever have to deal with that kind of thing. That wasn't your direct competition. Hell, even the Jaguar, had it had a better company behind it, even at $250 at that time, that was really expensive for a console. Even then, they wouldn't have been great competition to your Genesis. And then ultimately, when the Sega Saturn come out, everybody knew that was going to be more expensive. But you had to worry about Sony, for God's sakes. Your reaction to, or Sega's reaction to everything that Sony did was wrong. I mean, for the love of God, it's like they already faced down one titan with Nintendo. And the only reason that ended up well for Sega is because halfway through that battle, Nintendo lost its stranglehold on third parties, which allowed Sega to reap the benefits of some of that loss. Before then, Sega had to be reactionary to everything because Sega had to make everything themselves. Once the third parties were cut loose, Sega was then able to soak up some of their good games, which allowed the Genesis to sort of expand on the market. It allowed Sega some breathing room to create games that were actually really good because they didn't have to put out 100 games a year anymore because they had legitimate third-party support. Right. When the Saturn comes along, they face another titan in Sony. And what was the first thing Sony did that just crippled Sega? They wrapped up the third-party support again. Mm-hmm. Now, it wasn't at the same level as Nintendo did with the bullshit contracts and the monopolies, that, I mean, you could get into a whole legal, discussion about how Nintendo did that without being, just sued off their ass, even back in the 80s. But the point is that when they faced down Sony, they had lost the third-party support again, which left the Saturn just utterly floundering. Yeah. Sega was once again in the spotlight where they were having to make everything of substance again for their home console. they lost the advantage that they had with the Genesis. And then all of a sudden, they were having to spit out games as fast as they could. Quality suffered. There's a reason why Bug isn't as good as it is. There's a reason why, Clockwork Knight had to be split across 2 games.
They were under the gun, right?
Right.
They were operating from a sense of urgency and a sense of like, there's a play clock going. When you're behind, you're just looking at the person in front of you and worrying about like copying their moves, right? And you have the benefit of being able to watch those that are successful. But once you're ahead, you just spend all your time worrying about the people who are behind you, basically, right? Like Initial D, you got them in there in your rear view mirror, and you're like, now the pressure's on because you have to stay in the lead, and they'd never experienced that before, what it was like to be in the lead. Now they've got it. They're on top, they're where Nintendo was for years, but it's like the market is changing at that exact time, and now there's like several players, and it all happened because of what they did. You know what I mean? They disrupted the market in a big way, taking on Nintendo, taking on the status quo, getting the retailers to like work with them. You know what I mean? And Nintendo had such a stranglehold on the market. Sega comes in and destroys that dominance and creates a power vacuum. And now a bunch of players rush in. And so it's like right as they got on top, everything's changing, and it's like a dog pile, and they just can't control the situation anymore. So they really went on the defensive, really became super reactionary, and they just kind of focused on their competitors and just like rushing production and creating second tier titles, basically, because they were just trying to push anything out so that they had something. Meanwhile, Sega in Japan is just kind of doing what they want to do, making games for this console that they've thought out. They took a long time to think out the Saturn, and they spent a long time developing it, and they wanted, Sega of America to be completely on board. They weren't. But in Japan, they're just making really, really Japanese games for a really Japanese public, right? And a lot of them are eating it up, but it's hard to sell a lot of that stuff in the West, because it just doesn't necessarily translate.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think there's probably another factor as well, because when we were talking about the 32X just now, obviously we know that it was a flop, but ultimately the initial Western launch was fairly successful. For that, if it had that brief flicker of light, didn't it? And then it just completely crashed and burned.
Because they couldn't keep their mouths. I mean, well, because the thing is, everyone across the world knew that it was a stopgap. Had it been an isolated in a vacuum, yes, people would have been very interested in extending the life of their Genesis, right? But knowing that there was another console releasing overseas at the same time, news just traveled too fast. You know what I mean?
The world was getting smaller, and the rate of technology was another factor. But the thing I was thinking of just now is you look at the Sega 32X titles. I mean, they weren't all existing Sega IPs, but you had Virtual Racing, which we'd seen on the MegaDriver Genesis that year. We had Doom, which was a massive IP at the time, and we had Star Wars Arcade, again another big IP. And I think maybe where some of this kind of comes to a head is when you think about the games that are successful in the West. What games were successful in Japan, and why would the developers in Japan have an interest in making a sequel to a game that was say popular over there? Mm-hmm. And when you think of it like that, Japan wanted to try and find, they wanted to find that secret sauce. They wanted to find something magic that that would be a success over there. And they eventually got that with Virtua Fighter. And you see Virtua Fighter, and then that's the stalwart through the Saturn's life. You had Virtua Fighter, then Remix, then 2, then Kids, then Fighters Mega Mix. And then what happens when the Dreamcast launches, Virtua Fighter 3TB launches alongside it. But Virtua Fighter wasn't big for the US audience. And I think if you look at what Sega focused on, Sega America were very much, these are the games that wanted for the 32X. I think they knew what the audiences wanted over there in terms of software to launch with their console. Whereas Japan, I think they were still searching. And when it came to the Saturn, and then they kind of had that rush launch, that's when Sega of America kind of had to make do with what the Saturn had at the time, which wasn't really what the typical tastes were for gamers in the West. And I think that might be another reason why they do have this kind of identity crisis, because they never really had a surefire hit in Japan until, they had Sakura Wars, which that followed through from Saturn to Dreamcast. They had Virtual On. Again, obviously that's the arcade there, but then they had that in Virtua Fighter. But they didn't really have kind of that mega hit that they were always searching for in Japan. And I think that might be why they were like, well, that didn't work over here. We'll try something else. So I think that might be a factor there as well.
Honestly, I think that, that's actually something that we should really consider, because regionally, why would Japan make a Streets of Rage 4? It's not like Streets of Rage 2 and 3 sold well in Japan. Why would, Sega of Japan make a NBA game or an NFL game when it came to sports? These are games that had to be developed and really carried on by the other development arms, the other parts of the company with Sega, and they never did. Either because they didn't have the assets or manpower to make it happen, they didn't have the skill. If that may have been the case, I don't know. What it ultimately came down to is when it was time for Sega of America to earn its keep, where it was no longer given games by Japan that were guaranteed to sell, Sega of America was MIA. They did not have the software really to put on the market. Now, you can blame the rush launch of the Saturn for that, but even then, when you look at it, they still had the wrong games with the stuff that eventually came out.
I mean, they tried with Sega Technical Institute, but that was kind of a botched experiment. I mean, they got a taste of bringing Yuji Naka over to do, Sonic 2. He kind of defected with his cronies over to the US and kind of needed a break from Japan, right? Because he just wants freedom to do things his way, right? And then they're like, oh, that's a great idea. Bring a bunch of Japanese people over here and we'll, kind of have our own studio, STI, right? I think Mark Cerny was heading that up, but there was a bunch of problems with the visas and stuff. They couldn't get all that straightened out, and the Japanese guys ended up getting sent back to Japan because they filled out the applications wrong. And I think they ended up with like 1 or 2 Japanese guys, and ultimately it just ended up being kind of a failed experiment. It was a great idea, kind of an exchange program between the countries, but yeah, no, it didn't really pan out that great. They made a few games, but again, it's a drop in the bucket by comparison. And they were MIA essentially, always beholden to what Sega of Japan was making. And Sega of Japan, they were tired of making Sonic games, right? Can we all agree? Like you look at Knights and Burning Rangers, and then I don't know, they had to do the PSO in Phantasy Star Online, but they had to, make Sonic games because that's basically printing money,
But a lot of people automatically assume that a Saturn Sonic had to be just a continuation of the Genesis games, and it really didn't have to be that way. They could have evolved Sonic into something completely, not necessarily completely different, but that had a lot of innovation in terms of how you played it. I mean,
like a racing game?
No, I mean, doing that, they sort of stripped away the essence of what most people saw in Sonic. I think that it still had a charm, and I think that's why it has its fans, but I mean, you had to do something with Sonic that was recognizable, but I think it was still room for that game to be more than just a side-scrolling hop on top of the enemy's head and, keep moving. It could have been more than that. Just like Streets of Rage could have been more than just, walk right and beat up people. I mean, those games could have evolved. They could have added things. There's a reason why Castlevania became so much better over the years. It's because it evolved from a 2D action game where you just had a whip and a sub weapon. It evolved into Castlevania Symphony of the Night. It took in aspects of other genres. Sega's games didn't evolve like that. Sega's idea was just to reset everything and make something entirely new. I don't necessarily think that was good for the brand overall. You had to have something linking people to the company, what they expected. Expectation is everything in gaming.
Mhm.
You know, if you strip away those expectations, what's left for a consumer to be interested in with you? You know, it really comes down to that. I mean, that was the problem with Virtua Fighter, wasn't it? There
Mhm.
was an expectation in Japan for Virtua Fighter to essentially, by itself, sell the Sega Saturn. And that's exactly what it did
In Japan, yeah,
in
exactly.
Japan. What did Sega have to sell the Saturn in the United States of America, which was, you know, at the time, the biggest gaming market in the world? You know,
Not a
what
whole
was
lot.
there? I mean, just look at the Saturn over its first, I mean, let's expand it over the first year and a half.
Yeah.
What was on the Saturn to sell it to the casual mass market? There
That's
was
the
nothing.
keyword, casual, right? Because for weird
Yeah,
people like me, Panzer Dragoon worked, Daytona USA worked, Knights
of
worked, but I mean,
course.
I'm weird, right? And I admit that. Like to the casual average to the PlayStation buying gamer, like what's there to appeal them to come over to the Sega camp, you know? But you talk about Sonic, you talk about innovating that brand, right? They were caught between this expectation that new games must be 3D and a fundamental inability to make a 3D Sonic game. You know what I mean? It just happened to be that's the right time or the wrong time in their case, where they weren't willing to do a 2D Sonic. They weren't willing to innovate in 2D. You know, it had to be 3D. But wait, we can't do 3D. We're not good enough at it yet. We don't understand the hardware, and we certainly can't. We can hardly make a Sonic game, much less innovate a new Sonic game, you know, in 3D. So they kind of shot themselves in the foot, didn't they?
But they had the idea already, didn't they? I
Sure.
mean, they had Clockwork Knight. Clockwork
True.
Knight had polygon backgrounds. It
Hmm.
had the main character being able to be shot into the background, which puts you on a completely different path.
Hmm.
They had the innovation staring them in the face of what to do with Sonic. Why couldn't they just expand on that? Why not give Sonic multiple 3D routes in a 2.5D playfield where polygons could litter the landscape and give everybody the polygons they needed?
That's a
I
fair
mean,
point.
Sega had the ideas
Yeah.
right there already done for them. They just never used them.
Right.
Reactionary, man. When you're reactionary to everything, you never look at all your options. You don't look at every card you hold in your hand. That was Sega's big problem right
But I
there,
mean,
man.
did they really love Sonic like we did in the West?
They
Did
didn't.
they didn't, right? So I mean, we're don't it just occurs to me that maybe they were a little sick of it, you know, like they were just like, oh, we have to keep making these games because they keep selling so well in the West and it helps make us money. But as creators, as artists, we don't feel like we're fulfilling our, you know, need to create or whatever. And so and you know, one thing that could be said about Sega is that they're innovative and risk taking, and they have a lot of crazy ideas when it comes to games. You know, Crazy Taxi, Clockwork Knight is pretty crazy. Well, you know, I don't know what inspired it, if it was like Pixar's Tin Toy or whatever, but they had this idea. You know, let's make this game with toys that come to life. And I mean, it's pretty out there. I'm just thinking like maybe they just wanted to go in a different direction. But yeah, no, I mean, they needed to keep making Sonic games for the bottom line, but they didn't really want to, it seems like.
Well, you know, that was the fine line between Sega as a business and Sega as artist wanting to create something. You know, I recently did a video where I saved the Sega
Yes,
Dreamcast.
right.
And one of the things I did in that video was is I canceled Shinmu, man.
Hmm.
And I got a lot of like, you
I'm
know,
sure.
hate for doing that in that video, dude. And you know, that really is a good explanation, though, isn't it? Sega fans are Sega fans because they loved Sega for what Sega was.
Hmm.
For Sega to be successful, for Sega to just pull a Sony, Sega would have been Sony. Sega would have been making the status quo games. Would
Right.
Sega still have the same spirit the same innovation, the same specialness, had they been financially successful making the games you expected them to make. Instead, we got Sega's out there all over the place personality making these crazy games that nobody else would try. And that's the reason why Sega is Sega. So, there really is two sides. You could sit here and like bash on Sega. You didn't do this, you didn't do that. And I do love to do that, by the way.
Sure,
but
we all do.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you also have to ask yourself, would Sega have been Sega if they had gone any other route?
Yeah,
well, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we had a comment on one of our videos recently, and someone said, I really wish that they just gave us a proper Sonic game instead of Nights into Dreams. And Nights into Dreams was my favorite game on the Sega Saturn, the same as you, Dave. And I always say I would not give up Nights into Dreams for anything, which, is weirdly selfish when you think about the fact that if Sega actually just put a gun to Yuji Naka's head and said, don't make this game, which is not going to sell and that we can't market, and just make another Sonic game, that may have been a shot in the arm that the Sega Saturn needed. So Mel, that's a great point. I mean, that I watched your Dreamcast video as well, and I remember you saying that about Shenmue, and it makes perfect sense. And that's the conflict between Sega as an artistic video game maker and a business. And I think you see that throughout their entire life.
So here's a thought that you basically made me just think of right now as you were saying this, is that, okay, so we want Sega to be this weird company. We want them to go against good business sense. We want them to make a bunch of risky games that probably wouldn't sell that much. It basically sounds like we want them to be kind of like an indie game maker. And now that game publishing is so much cheaper because it's mostly done via digital and they don't have to worry about making hardware, they're in a much better position to do that actually these days, as just a game maker and game publisher. But at the same time, there has to be something said for the hardware that they did make, because for some reason, their games on their hardware always felt kind of unique and special. Am I completely out of my mind in saying that there is something lost in just a Sega game on the Switch or the Xbox or whatever versus a Sega game on the Dreamcast? Is it apples and apples? Or because to me, it just seems like, Sega at their craziest, like making games for the Dreamcast, Seaman or whatever, whether you like it or not. But I mean, crazy stuff like, Space Channel 5 and stuff. It's just like they were so wacky, and those games fit that hardware so well. It's just funny to think about, because what you're saying is that us as Sega fans, we just want Sega to continue to be weird and innovative and crazy and careless. And they're in a much better place to do that without having the ball and chain of supporting hardware and just being able to publish digitally. But at the same time, something's lost from that is what I'm saying, because each console generation, be it the Genesis, the Saturn, or the Dreamcast, gave them this like very tangible identity, this very tangible kind of like personality.
That may be something that's actually lost in gaming altogether, isn't it? The specialness of just the hardware itself, the identity that the hardware brought. I mean, go back and you look at the Master System, the way that system was so colorful and that unique sound that it gave was so different from the NES. Look at the Genesis, and that FM sound was so different from the Super Nintendo. The Saturn's architecture was just the wildest thing ever, and no game on any console looked like a Saturn game. And even when it came to the Dreamcast, those sharp VGA visuals, in many respects, looked so different from the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube and whatnot. And fast forward to modern gaming, it almost seems like all of it's based off of the same hardware. There's no personality there anymore. It's just PC derivatives that are pumping out different resolutions and frame rate. There's no special chips that make the Switch something unique. There's no special graphics mode of the Xbox Series X that makes its games look so tailored to that hardware. And we've lost that just totally in the years since Sega was making consoles.
So what we've lost is those not just artificial, but very real limitations that a bespoke piece of hardware puts on the developers. And those limitations often inform creativity, right? Like they had a certain hardware to work with in order to make Panzer Dragoon Zwei. And so they had to pull out every little trick that they could possibly do. And those limitations ended up creating a visual style of that game, right? Because the way that it looks, a lot of it is the result of them having to kind of cut corners and find workarounds in order to get it running and looking the way they wanted it to on the Saturn. So nowadays, developers have to kind of put artificial limitations on themselves if they want to kind of like, do minimalist game design. And you do see that. You see demakes and you see like indie game developers kind of putting constraints on themselves. But when a developer was actually just, in all honesty, trying to squeeze every ounce of power out of the console, but the console was really only going to go so fast or give them so many polygons, that kind of breeded creativity, in games making, and that's something that you can try to like artificially create it, but it's not real, because we don't really have hardware limitations anymore. It's like, here's the PC version, and then, okay, it's going to filter down to the top tier consoles, and then it's going to be 720p on the Switch, and it's going to run at half the frame rate, but it's basically the same game. Like with the Dreamcast, you look at, like, we were just talking about Tokyo Extreme Racer and how it has like those sharp razor edges, to everything. And like the specular highlights or reflections and stuff look completely different on the Dreamcast than when they ported it over to the PlayStation 2. And it kind of had that muddy Vaseline look to it, And I
like
love
all
PlayStation 2
games.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just, but the Dreamcast, yeah, it just had that visual style. And I do feel like with the Dreamcast, they did really kind of make a concerted effort to going back and porting a lot of stuff from the arcade. The Dreamcast does definitely feel like, man, this is an arcade machine, with so many arcade games on it. Not that the Saturn didn't have arcade games, but it was kind of like, aside from Virtua Fighter and Daytona Sega Rally, it was stuff like Winter Heat, which I'm not even sure I ever played Winter Heat or Decathlete or, any of those STV games in the arcade. I don't, Die Hard Arcade. That was the only STV game that I actually played on an STV back in the day, because that was at our movie theater. But yeah, like the Saturn, even the Saturn doesn't feel like it had nearly as many arcade games as the Dreamcast did, where they really doubled down on arcade ports and a bunch of original IPs at the same time.
Which is crazy when you think when they had the new challenge conference and they said that they want to get away from being stigmatized with just a company that makes arcade ports.
Right.
And yeah, it's crazy that that's kind of where they ended up settling. Again, I think just being reactionary and constrained by development costs. We had Virtua Fighter 3 TB, which was rushed to launch. And then we had Sega Rally 2, which again, it was rushed and it was a bit of a mess technically in the way that it had been ported from the PC. But if you look at all the extra content it had on there, it had the 10-year championship mode, and that sort of stuff was fantastic. And it just felt, Crazy Taxi had a whole new city and the Crazy Box, and it felt like, yeah, we're going back to really making these arcade ports substantial. And then they kind of tail off again at the end when you get stuff like Fighting Vipers, which is a bit of a step down from the Model 3 arcade game and is pretty much just a bare bones port. And they just and again, I think it is just them being constrained by what would have been cost at the time, more than anything else, more than any other era at that point, I'd imagine.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting that you bring up the new era stuff. The games that, Sega's working on now, it's interesting to see how they've evolved as a software maker over the years, and to see them taking some of those new IPs in new directions. I have to say, aside from all the negativity that you'll read about those games, online, I have to admit, I am really excited to see what they do with these new games that they're developing. I want to see how this, Golden Axe is going to turn out. I want to see what they're going to do with Crazy Taxi. I want to see that Jet Set Radio. I want to see that new side-scrolling Shinobi that, they stole my idea by using the Okami graphics, man. But
Yep.
anyhow, I'm so interested to see what Sega is going to do with that stuff because, I always said that one of the strengths of the Shinobi series was when the Game Gear versions came out and they had sort of almost some Metroidvania aspects to them. And this new one coming out, it looks kind of like a Metroidvania, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really excited to see because a lot of these games are what I was literally thinking Sega needed to do back on the Saturn and Dreamcast with these IPs. Basically, just turn them completely around and make them something new again. If they were going to reinvent themselves with new IP, with new games,
Mm-hmm.
why go that far? Why not take the recognizable IPs that you had and just reinvent those?
Right.
Why wasn't there a Metroidvania Shinobi on the Dreamcast? You know, why didn't Sega latch onto those ideas? And it's in a way, it's these new games, this new era, new energy stuff that's, coming out.
Right.
It's interesting to me because this is where I wanted Sega to go with the Saturn and Dreamcast in a lot of ways. And I really want to see where that software ends up. And God, am I hoping it's good.
Yeah, I'm hoping that. Part of me thinks that given a lot of their approach to modern games these days, so they seem to have these three pillars now. So they've got the Yakuza games, the Yakuza series, the Sonic series, and they've got Persona, and they seem to have fallen into this pattern now, especially in the last few years, where every year you will see an entry for each, and it doesn't matter if it's going to be a new mainline entry or a remaster. Right. So you had a remaster of Ishin last year, and then you had the remaster of Persona 3 Reload this year. You've got the remaster of Sonic Generations this year, and they seem to be really milking those cash cows.
Persona's still Atlas though, right? They acquired Atlas, but
yeah,
I mean, it's still Atlas making those games, right? They pretty much have like.
But I think Sega are. Sega has said I think it was in a business report that they said that they wanted to ensure that there was a new Persona every year, a new Sonic every year, a new Yakuza every year. Yeah. And I'm hoping that the fact that they've got those to rely on top of the fact that they have a new Total War every year and they have
Total
a new
War football manager,
manager every year, that it just allows them to really just properly develop those new era games. And give them the time and the backing that they really need and deserve. Right. I do love that they're a lot of them are trying to do something different. The news about Crazy Taxi came out, that it's going to be kind of an open world, MMO, well, not an MMO, but kind of like a big 100-player, huge online game.
Right.
There's a lot of people saying, "Oh no, I just want my classic Crazy Taxi," and I was like, I think they are making the original one, but you have got to take these things in new directions. So, yeah, it's exactly what you said, Mel. It's great that we're seeing these games being taken into different ways. That as far as Shinobi and even Golden Axe, we should have seen maybe 20 years ago, but at least it's happening now.
Yeah, they have to, because I mean the IPs themselves are going to entice old guys like us, but they also have to make games for a new generation. Because what is Sega to younger generations, really? Because I think Sega is almost synonymous with like being a 90s kid. It really is like my childhood, But, new generations, they really need to find a way to resonate with new generations, which means they have to try to innovate with their games. And I think that it's good with Crazy Taxi, making it multiplayer, online, engaging like that is going to be only good for them moving forward in terms of getting a new audience and remaining relevant as a games company. But they can get all of us to tag along just by saying we're making a Crazy Taxi game. I'm happy. But yeah, so that's what I was going to ask you, is like, what kind of company is Sega today, compared to like their competitors and just as a company in general? Mel made a comment a couple years ago about how like they're essentially just owned by a holdings company, but it seems like the leash has kind of been let out a little bit. Sammy's like interested in kind of okay, we're making some money off of some of these IPs. We've licensed into film and stuff, and the Sonic movies are doing gangbusters. Okay, maybe they know what they're doing, let out the leash a little bit. What do you think about that?
Yeah, when you really look at the company from a business perspective, have you ever looked up Sega stock to see what Sega's worth?
Oh, right.
It's not much, man.
No.
I mean, Sega as a company, they almost have to play it safe because, if they had you know, 3, 4 disastrous games come
Mhm.
out that didn't sell well, you're talking about that company would be on the verge of being swallowed up by someone else because Sega Sammy Holdings does not trade at a very high rate. We're
Right.
talking, $4 or $5 a share here, where even the smallest, modern third party sells for or trades for many times that. They're worth many times that. Something like Capcom is worth way more than Sega is today. And
Mhm.
I think that translates into Sega plays it safe more often than not.
Mhm.
Sega has latched on to these properties. And like Dan was saying, every year you're going to get like a Dragon game. You're going to get, something from Atlas. You're going to get these games that are games that Sega knows are going to sell a certain amount and have a certain return. And outside of that, Sega really doesn't take chances anymore, do they? They haven't
Right.
taken chances for many, many years. And that's where really have to understand, how does Sega exist today? And they really are just a holdings company. They strike out every now and then when there's a little bit of money to be made, and then that's it. That's all you're ever going to get from Sega, which
Mhm.
is kind of, in my opinion, what made the New Era, New Energy announcement so surprising, because
Yeah.
I didn't expect Sega to try something like that. And if you had told me that was coming at the time, I would have expected games that were in development for maybe a year at most. They were going to be shat out on the market and forgotten, and that was going to be the end of it. But here we are now. We are, well away from the announcement of those games. You really haven't heard a lot more about them. They're obviously still in development. It
Mhm.
looks like Sega may actually be putting some time and energy into this, which is really, again, surprising, given that the company has existed the way it's existed since pretty much, what, 2004? Was that when the Sammy merger happened, if I
Yeah,
remember right?
yeah,
Yeah. Mhm.
2004.
Yeah. And I mean, modern Sega, for the longest time, in my opinion, was so unexciting. It's not that they weren't capable of making good games. I really like the Yakuza games, man. Some of those games are fun. I'm doing a best of the best Sega games, ever episode, and the Yakuza games command most of the years, wins that I give Sega,
Mhm.
because those games are so good, but they were also so expected. You knew those games were coming. Nothing surprised you anymore with Sega. So, maybe Sega is trying something here. Maybe if their Golden Axe comes out and it kind of is a Souls like in a little bit of ways, which draws attention, maybe it mixes some elements of past games like Otagi or Bayonetta, where you get these extreme combos, and there's a deep gameplay mechanic there, something that maybe is attached to the modern God of War games. Maybe
Mhm.
Sega is really trying to create this new tier of software release that, if it goes well, we may see Sega really a renaissance hit them again,
Mhm.
which I know is a lot to heap
It's
onto
so.
these games. But it's
Yeah.
exciting. It's exciting at the same time, because I really want them to put the effort to make this stuff something special.
I'm glad they're doing so many because I figure at least one of them's got to be good.
Yeah, one of them.
I'm just like, come on, please. But I mean, I'm hoping that they're all good, and I'm probably gonna buy all of them. But I mean, yeah, I'm just really hoping. What are the odds that all of them are stinkers?
Oh,
It's funny, the Jet Set Radio one. I was like, wow, that's pretty bold to do that after Bomb Rush Cyberpunk came and just like knocked it out of the park, right? And I'm like, okay, they've they got a tough act to follow, and this is their franchise. But like Bomb Rush Cyberpunk is just so good. I'm like, okay, there's an expectation there, and I'm sure they're aware of it. But what I saw from the very brief trailer looked amazing, and I'm definitely excited for that. Do you think that Sega as a brand resonates with younger audiences, or do you think it's mostly old farts like us?
Oh man, it's the funniest thing watching some of the people in my family, even some of the ones that aren't much younger than me. When I try to talk to them about Sega, it's like, way over their head. They don't know anything about Sega. You have to think Sega's been out of business long enough now that someone in their 20s
Mhm.
may have realistically never played one of their consoles. Let that sink in for a minute.
Right.
Someone in their 20s may never have played a Sega console. And, given the fact that the Saturn and Dreamcast didn't sell well, you're talking about someone in their 30s could possibly never have played a Sega console. And
Mhm.
that disconnect is absolutely real, because when you include everything that's being included in the deluge of indie games, it's really easy to miss Sega these days.
Mhm.
It's really easy to not play a Sega game these days. If you're hyper focused on what dominates the market now, especially when it comes to live service games and whatnot that really command a lot of the attention of younger people, you know, does Sega exist at all for the younger audience?
Right.
And I mean, I think that's the uphill battle that these new games we were just talking about have. I mean,
Mhm.
not only do they have to win over the older crowd that are going to look at it, with their like retro eyes, but you have to win over that younger crowd that, number one, they don't know what the hell it is. And number two, you're going to have to make it good enough that it stands out in that lineup of all those games that are available today. And Sega's got its work cut out for it, man. I mean, the younger audience is fickle and they are hard to win over.
They really are.
And yeah, they really are.
I mean,
So
just judging from my own kid, like he's not that impressed with any of the Sonic games. That so it's like when Sonic Mania comes out, or when the most recent one,
Sonic Frontiers.
yeah,
All those
Frontiers.
Frontiers, and what's the one that just came out? It's a co-op.
Oh, Superstars.
Superstars. Okay, so
Yeah.
yeah, Mania, Frontiers, Superstars. We have them all, right? And Jesse's just lukewarm on all of them, right? And but he loves Pokemon, and he loves like a lot of he loves Minecraft and Roblox and all that stuff. But like, uh, he'll play Sonic a little bit because I'm like want him to play it. But I mean, yeah, it's just like I don't know that it resonates with him nearly as much. And so for us, it's like we're judging these games based on our expectations and how we feel they live up to like the original franchise on the Genesis and stuff. But the younger kids are just like, yeah, I don't even it's just like they can't even be bothered. I don't know about your kids, Dan, but
Yeah, mine
yeah,
mine are the same. I try to impress upon them
right.
the luxuries of Sega, but they're the same. It's Minecraft, it's Animal Crossing, Roblox, and all that stuff. And yeah,
Their
Sega really do.
tastes.
It is. I think
Yeah.
Sega have an uphill battle in convincing people to play these new games. They got to convince us we're gonna scrutinize these games.
Mhm.
They've also got to win over the critics, and then they've got to win, and then that may be, but not necessarily guaranteed, a path to another audience. But they
Right.
faced this before when they transitioned to being a third party developer,
Mhm.
because if you look at what they did when they moved from the Dreamcast, there was a deluge of recognizable IP that descended upon whether it was GameCube, PlayStation, or Xbox. I don't know why they had this approach with making games so exclusive to those platforms, which was kind of frustrating. But they did
Mhm.
have things like they had a new Shinobi game, they had Altered Beast, wasn't great, but they were trying to resurrect some of these games onto the newer consoles. And of course, in Japan, you had the Sega 2500 catalog. And I don't think they really had any significant successes. I mean, even Panzer Dragoon Auto, which is pretty well regarded by people within the industry and within the community, I don't think it sold extremely well. And these games just kind of still were curios, which, you know, the Sega faithful latched onto, and we ended up having to buy all the consoles because our favorite games were everywhere now. But I don't think they captured the mass market in a way that they wanted to. You know, they had Echo on the PS2 after it was on the Dreamcast, and that didn't sell enormously well.
Right.
Virtua Fighter 4, I think, was a success, but mainly in Japan. So are they going to have that penetration, or, you know, is it going to be like, you know, they had 2001 to 2004, they were trying to resurrect all these old franchises with really mixed results, and then the Sammy merger came in, swallowed them up, and then they just got ultra conservative again. And I'd hope that doesn't repeat itself. Obviously, I don't see them getting bought out again, but I mean, the fact that if these new era games don't do well, or if they get a miss, then they just kind of shrink back into their shell again, which I think it's a possibility. And yeah, what you were saying, Mel, about, you know, they're not a huge company. You know, I think you look at, I think they're just in the top 10, maybe just outside third parties. Capcom, I think they're about the level just under Square Enix's level. So they really can't suffer too many big shocks financially. So we'll have to see how they go. I'm kind of optimistic though. There has been a lot of interest in those games, so fingers crossed. We'll see.
I mean, they're fundamentally good. I think like they're good ideas that worked well the first time and offer a lot of in the way they're moving, especially with like Crazy Taxi and making it an online multiplayer game. I think that it has the potential to be a big success. You know, I'm just hoping that it's really all in the execution, because the IPs are already there, the characters are there, you know, like the design aesthetic is there, and all that hard work was done years ago by brilliant people. You know, like they're really just standing on those shoulders, and they've got to execute, you know, and just do a really good job. If they can bring it to market and just have it be, you know, like a 7.5 or 8 out of 10, I'm sure it'll be fine, you know, but to use an arbitrary number. But I mean, ironically, Jesse, like he likes Persona 5 probably, and that's the one game I can't let him play because there's just too much adult stuff. That's probably the one he's most interested in, you know. And I don't know, like but yeah, like Sega as a company, it's funny, maybe a little sad to think that they were once synonymous with video games. You know, at one point it was Sega and Nintendo, you know, and even to a greater extent Sega, you know, during the 90s, at least in the West. You know, I mean, being a 90s kid, I was just telling Gerald from PRGE, you know, being a 90s kid was Sega, you know, and all the ads, you know, from an ad standpoint, who they were as a marketing company, you know, it's like very, very confident and cocky with the Genesis, you know, and then just kind of went off the wall with the Saturn. Really, really weird. You know, one of the things that always just kills me is that it's like, you guys make great games. Just show the games, for God's sake. You know what I mean? They had to bullshit a little bit with stuff like the Mega CD. Now, hear me out. There are some good games on the Sega CD, Mega CD, right? But the stuff they were showing in that commercial where they're like, you waiting for Nintendo to make one, you know? The kid's like getting blasted in his chair, you know, and there's all this stuff flying at him, and like they're showing very little gameplay, because what they're showing is like a bunch of crappy FMV sequences, right? And the kid's just like pinned to the back of his chair, like, this is so exciting. I'm like watching this commercial the other day. I'm just like, wow, there is not a whole lot of actual game footage here. They're trying to sell you on some kind of idea of how extreme this system is, but really it's like, if you cut out all of that bullshit and just show the game footage, you're like, wow, this is the most boring commercial ever. They're probably like, how do we sell Sewer Shark?
It's funny, you know, the phrase blast processing is, you know, everyone talks about the marketing term, the blast processing, but the actual advert that's connected to is fantastic, because it shows Mario Kart on the ice cream truck, doesn't it? And it shows a bit of Mario Kart. You can see that. Yes. But then it blasts through all this game footage at a really fast pace, and that is Sega. Perfect.
One of their best commercials, in my opinion.
It is. I totally agree. And I mean, the game, again, I do like the clever visuals and stuff like that, but the game really sells itself. I can't overstate the fact that when we saw Sonic moving at speed, like I had never seen anything like that before. Maybe like in the arcade with like Afterburner 2 or something like that, I saw maybe some of that kind of speed, but like this is of course like scrolling speed, right? And I'm just like, oh my God, I've never seen a game move that fast. It was ridiculous. So I mean, we really did buy into the blast processing because frankly, we'd never seen another home video game console
The
work
evidence
like
was
that.
there.
You play Super Mario World, which is fundamentally a great game, but it moves so slow. It's a plodding platformer. With Sonic, it's you almost have to slow down at points because you're just going way too fast for your own good. But yeah, no, I mean, I often feel like the games, if they would just show game footage, people could easily decide. Sometimes a game sucks and you have to sell it. You have to kind of fake it and convince people that it's great until they get it home and then they realize what a mistake they made. But a lot of times the games would be great and they would spend so much time showing you a bunch of stuff that didn't matter, and not showing you the game. And yeah, that's just one of those things that I have a pet peeve about. I'm just like, just show the game.
So no campaign does that worse than the Dreamcast launch campaign in the UK, where not a single piece of
Oh,
gameplay footage
yes.
was shown, and it's all
Right.
these weird, quirky, with the whole up to 6 billion players
Up to
tagline,
six.
which they got into hot water for because the online functionality wasn't there at launch, and because you couldn't
Right.
actually have 6 billion people
Like
playing.
false marketing.
Yeah,
It
so
was, yeah.
they got into hot water about that. But like, they had the barber advert, and I remember seeing it in the we went to the cinema, and it was showing at the Phantom Menace. Before the Phantom Menace, before the biggest film of the year, they had a
Mhm.
Dreamcast advert here, and it's just these barbers, and we're all sitting there like, "What's this?" And then it's Dreamcast at the end. It's like, "What the hell was that? Why didn't you show Sonic Adventure or Soul Calibur or Power Stone? What are you doing?"
It was like a whole generation of like ad folks that were like inspired by David Lynch or something like that. But the fact is, it's like if the game's not fun, nobody's gonna care. It's like, yeah, maybe your ad is clever and out there and people will laugh at it, but I mean, ultimately, nobody's gonna waste $60 on a game that's no fun, And looking at some of those screenshots on the back isn't enough. You gotta show us what the game is. So, it was never more was it more important to go into, place like EB or GameStop or whatever you had to actually be able to try out those games, Toys R Us or whatever, find yourself a kiosk and play some of those games because the ads just did a terrible job of selling it. Really, they did.
I think on the Saturn, the ad campaign almost mirrored the attitude of Sega of America, who chose those ads, because I think Sega of America was looking at the Saturn as like, God, this thing is terrible. These games suck. Nobody's going to care about Virtua Fighter. Nobody's going to care about Panzer Dragoon. Nobody's
Hmm.
going to care about this stuff. So they approved an ad campaign that pretty much didn't show you much of anything, didn't they?
And kind of
Uh,
almost made fun of itself,
yeah,
like
it
with the
really
the
did.
biker with the tutu on, or the kid going like, yeah, right,
Yeah.
yeah, it was almost like self-deprecating in a way. And it's
Yeah,
like
and
if you
that
just
idiot that was like dancing around the TV. You
yes,
remember that
yes,
moron?
oh my God. Every inch a Sega. You're right. They just didn't believe in the product at all. They really didn't.
Yeah,
And
they
it came
didn't.
from the top down, because we know like Tom didn't like it. We know a lot of the folks in position of power like did not like it and didn't believe in it. And it's like if your leader doesn't believe in it, that trickles down all the way down. But over in Japan, they think they got the best thing ever, They're like, this is great, I mean, yeah, you can focus all day about like how it performs next to Sony or how it performs next to N64, but it's not an N64 and it's not a PlayStation. It's a Saturn. You do what you can with it and you make the best games that you can on it, So you get stuff like Grandia going and it's an amazing game, right? And I don't hear anybody complaining. So it's like the folks who just kind of leaned into what they had and made the best of it made some really great games. And Lobotomy is like one of those few Western companies that were like, on board 100%, they made some great stuff. But
Oh, the biggest mistake Sega ever made during that generation was not buying those guys.
oh right.
Yeah, that company should have been bought and brought in studio,
First
man.
party.
It
Yeah.
yeah, in house. It boggles my mind that Sega didn't do that with all the trouble they were having in the West with
Yeah.
designing and releasing software for the Saturn.
Hmm.
And, they would ultimately need software for the Dreamcast, but all that trouble they had, and they never thought, hey, these guys know what the hell they're doing. Maybe we need to bring them in. And,
Yeah. They should have bought
it's,
Scavenger too. I think they should have bought
oh,
Scavenger because GT, instead of GT Interactive, got Scavenger, and GT Interactive are like the scumbags of the video game world, at least back then.
yeah.
So Good Times Interactive. They ended up cheating Scavenger out of I don't know, like $4 million or something like that. But if Sega had picked up Scavenger, those guys were brilliant in terms of like what they could get out of the Saturn. Pair them with some like good game design, good solid game design.
Yeah.
They were kind of like your Argonaut dudes. They knew how to get power out of the 32X and the Saturn, but they weren't that great about making a fully fledged game out of it. You had stuff like
they needed
Scorch.
to make they needed to make other people's games. Like,
Yeah.
could you imagine if Scavenger had made the
Mhm.
Saturn port of, say, something like Minx TT?
Sure,
I
it would have
mean,
been better.
yeah,
Yeah,
it would have
Mark,
been
I'm
better,
sure
Yeah.
they were
Can you imagine if
hackers.
they've done House of the Dead?
Yeah. Yeah, I know, right? And you're absolutely right. That's what Sega needed, especially since at that point they were relying so much on first party and maybe like second party. They really had a lack of good third party. Capcom of course was on board, Konami to a lesser extent. Was it Activision? No, Acclaim. Okay, they had a lot of support from Acclaim, and some of those games were turds, and then some were good. But I mean,
Last
that's
thing you need is Acclaim support, man.
right. But I mean, that's nothing compared to like the hundreds of third-party developers that Sony had. So yeah, you're absolutely right. They definitely should have brought those guys on board. But
I
yeah.
want to touch upon something that Dan said earlier
Hmm.
about Sega not releasing all of its games after the Dreamcast folded, multi-platform. Sega may have gone multi-platform, but they were multi-platform to the detriment of their fans, weren't they?
They were.
It's like on the Xbox, you're getting these awesome games, House of the Dead 3, and on the Xbox you get Orta, and it's like,
Hmm.
wow, these games are so great, but you had to have an Xbox to appreciate those games.
Right.
And then, you look on the PlayStation 2, and the PlayStation 2 only got certain Sega games itself. The Sega Ages 2500 line, that was only on the PlayStation 2.
Right.
And then there were some, even the GameCube got some exclusive Sega games. It boggles the mind that Sega would go multi-platform and not release all their games multi-platform.
Oh,
I mean, for the love of God, man, it's like sometimes you want a time machine and to go back, and you want to sit in on Sega's business meetings and just listen, not participate, just listen to
yeah.
how the hell they reached some of their decisions.
Yeah, it's crazy. You had PSO on the GameCube and the Xbox, but arguably PlayStation 2, which Sega had a relationship with them by that time. They were publishing games on PS2, but they didn't have PSO on PlayStation 2, and PlayStation 2 had arguably the strongest online, service at that point. But I mean, Xbox caught up, of course, but I mean, I could never figure that one out.
They never made
What?
an online Fantasy Star until Fantasy Star Universe, which launched in 2006, the same
Right.
the same year as the PS3. I mean,
Right.
it's insane that if you think, right, well, the Sega games I want to play in that generation, I want to play Virtua Fighter 4, I want to play Panzer Dragoon Auto, and I want to play Billy Hatcher and the Giant Egg. You have to buy 3 different consoles to
Yeah.
play all 3 of those games. It's madness. I mean, I midway through like 2003, 2004. My brother took our PS2 to university with him, and I was like, I'm all right. I've got my Xbox now. I don't need that. And then Virtua Fighter 4 comes out on the PS2. I'm like, yeah, Xbox
I need
port will
it
come
back.
eventually, and just like, oh man, I was so gutted it never came
And
to
then they made an
Xbox.
F-Zero game on the GameCube, right? One of the best F-Zero games. But yeah, so crazy.
I'd love to see what those decisions were, or
I
maybe
know.
just grab someone and just go, "Come on, what are you doing?"
Yeah.
Seriously. Yeah, as a company, it's been interesting, I think, for other companies to kind of learn from them, because they've made pretty much all the mistakes that you could make as a company, and it's true that throughout their history, they've always had struggle with kind of like an identity crisis. Are we an arcade company? Or do we want to focus on at home, adventure games? Do we want to churn out more of our existing IPs, or do we want to make a bunch of new stuff and take new risks? It's just, and always, just being very reactionary. It always seems like they're never quite 100% sure of the decisions that they're making. That, it's like, okay, well, we're going to try this rather than it being very cool and calculated decisions that have a lot of thought put behind them. Yeah. So that's
Well,
Sega.
when you really get down to it in a nutshell, that is Sega, because no matter the reasons you come up with why something failed, why did the Sega Saturn fail? Why did the Dreamcast fail? You can come up with 20 different reasons that were all part of it. But I don't think not a single one of those reasons could have been overcome had Sega made the right software decisions, because good games are going to sell hardware. I
Mhm.
mean, even when the hardware has something, you only need to look at systems like the Nintendo 64, man. Nintendo comes out with a cartridge only console with the explosion of CD technology,
Right.
charges $70 for these cartridges in the mid to late 90s, and somehow still outsold Sega. I mean, it's because the games Nintendo put on the market garnered the media attention and were good enough to grab the consumer's attention. And it sold that hardware.
I mean, you could also chuck those cartridges across the room and they'd still survive. Nintendo made games for kids, and that's kind of like I mean, recently they've been kind of becoming more adult with their stuff, like with the Switch and stuff. But historically, Nintendo was always very comfortable being a conservative game company that made sweet, upstanding games for young kids, basically, right? They didn't want to publish anything with blood. They didn't want to do anything that was too mature. They knew their market. They knew their market, and that's where the Nintendo 64 did so well. Is it was like all the parents just buying a game console for their little kids. They weren't about to buy like a PlayStation with some of the mature titles on there. So, and
But didn't Sega do the same thing during the Genesis era?
well, they did, but again, like Sega, they always wanted to court like the older gamer, like with the Genesis, they pushed really hard for like the teen gamer. But then it's like they failed to grow up with them and realize that it's like, okay, those teens aren't teens anymore now. Now they're young adults, and it's like Sony is courting them. Sony is getting all of our audience that were teenagers and loved the Genesis, but now they're young adults and they're looking for something different, and now comes in this new company who has like the perfect product for that. Again, Sega just was not completely sure of who their market was. I mean, feel free to disagree with me, but that's one of the things where I feel like Sony definitely knew who they were marketing the PlayStation to, and Nintendo is just Nintendo. They were mostly going to be making a kids console for kids with really durable, indestructible cartridges, but and ones that couldn't be easily pirated. But with Sega, it was kind of like half and half. Like they kind of just wanted a little bit of everything, but they didn't really like focus in on who was their market.
Yeah, I definitely think there's some truth to that because I mean the Genesis was successful because they targeted the demographic that Nintendo weren't targeting. I think was pretty much what I think Tom said they're targeting the kids. We'll go for the teens, but it seems like throughout that era they didn't grow up with them, and I don't think they grew up with their
Right.
arcade gamers either. They
Yeah.
didn't know how to transition that into the home. Whenever they have tried to kind of target a younger audience, they
Hmm.
just haven't grabbed them. I mean, you look at My kids today, they love their Minecraft and their Roblox and stuff, but they still love Nintendo stuff like Animal Crossing. I've got two daughters that absolutely adore that game. They all play Mario and stuff, and that stuff's got a hook. The Sega just, I don't think they've been able to target that younger demographic. And even though they've got a little bit of an older demographic with the Like a Dragon series now, and by extension, now they've got Atlas, they've got Persona, Shin Megami Tensei, etc. They still don't have that penetration. And I think the big issue for the Sega at the moment is I think they've got a lot of loyal fans of those series, but I don't think they know how to target the demographics outside of that, and I don't think they ever really have. Even the Dreamcast, who was the Dreamcast really marketed at? They were aiming for, whoever Sony. They're aiming for the same market that Sony were, but they didn't have that laser focus, and they weren't. Well, Sony are a very savvy company when it comes to marketing, and obviously Sega were nowhere near that. But you kind of get that approach all the way through.
Yeah,
every console you can. The Mega Drive and Genesis are probably the only time they've actually gone right. This is who we're targeting with this system and its games and our marketing, and they were successful. The Master System, it's a little bit less clear. I mean, as I was saying earlier, in the UK, they did target a little bit of an older demographic with the Master System at first, because it was expensive, and I think they were using 8-bit microcomputers at the time rather than consoles, so it was targeting that audience. And maybe that's why the Master System was something of a success over in this part of the world. But the one time that they did know who they were selling their games to, it does seem like they were a success. And outside of that, I think it has been, well, who are they making this for? Who are we making it for? Who are we going to market it to?
Yeah. They were coming from behind. They didn't have a whole lot to lose. They made a decision that this is what we're going to go after with the Genesis. We're going to market this to older kids and teens, and we'll get some of the younger kids who want to be cool and have what the older kids and teens do. And so then they began to lead, and they became a leader. But then they spent the Saturn and Dreamcast just becoming more of a follower, like you say, looking at what Sony did and just saying, okay, well, for the Dreamcast, let's just do what they're doing. Let's try to go after that same market demographic, and we'll add online in addition, and that'll be like our hook, But you're right. It's like they went from being a leader to a follower, and they were so worried and concerned about staying in the lead with after the Genesis, but things changed so rapidly and they just kind of lost control really quickly.
Listening to you guys talk, I just realized something. I was just talking about the Nintendo 64, and Dave says Nintendo was trying to sell to kids. And then I go back and I'm looking at the US the first year for the Saturn. Was the Saturn not marketed to kids? Virtua Fighter was a squeaky clean fighter, not an ounce of blood or fatality. Clockwork Knight was really a kid's platformer. Bug.
That's the problem then.
Yeah, that's the problem.
The kids, they already knew what they were going to get. They were going to hold out for Nintendo. And the parents were like, okay, Sega's that company that there was like court proceedings because because of them having like blood and violence and rape or whatever they claimed that was in their Night Trap, which it was so tame by anybody's standards now. But I mean, back then it's like, none of those parents actually played the game or ever saw the game. They just heard horror stories, and they're like, I don't want Bobby coming anywhere close to that Sega company. So I mean, parents, I think by and large had made up their minds to go Nintendo because it was a safe, known thing, and it's like, and so kids weren't buying their own console, certainly not a $400 console, a kid wasn't. So it's like, they kind of reverted back and we're making a bunch of kiddie stuff and like Dan said, they didn't grow up with their audience. Their audience that had been teens are now young adults and are looking for stuff like Resident Evil, and
probably looking at this squeaky clean fighter and these kiddie like platformers and thinking, what the hell is this? I'm going to go and play this futuristic racing game on my PlayStation,
Yeah, with the club music and everything like that. Yeah, or Dead or Alive, which we didn't get in the States, but it would have been amazing. But
I think we've said here and we have figured out why the Saturn failed in the West, man. They reverted back to trying to play Nintendo's game and just failed miserably, while technically Sony did what Sega did to Nintendo the previous generation.
Yeah.
Sony out Sega.
I really wish I do wish before he's gone that I have an opportunity to talk to Steve Race, because nobody ever talks about Steve Race, and he was the guy. He was the guy who like helped market the Genesis in the West, and had all these brilliant ideas, and then Sony got him and he ended up dropping the 299, and I'm like, that guy must have a bunch of great stories,
the balls on that guy to get up there and just say that and walk
seriously.
away.
Yeah.
I mean, can you imagine what he was thinking before that? He was just like, Sega just released the Saturn, completely surprised the world. I'm just going to walk up there and undercut them by $100 and steal that thunder completely away. Mm-hmm. I mean, in a way, you really have to admire somebody that had that kind of like confidence to do that. He didn't talk about games. He didn't talk about power of system. The only thing that dude did was say 299. I don't even think he looked up from his notes. And then he walked away.
Yeah.
I mean, God, man. I mean, that's the mentality. That was Sega in the early 90s. Mm-hmm. And Sony just totally took it, man.
Yeah.
That was some shit Sega would have done to Nintendo,
I can guarantee,
years before.
Yeah, I can guarantee you that the theater of the eye would, and it's out there. None of that stuff would have happened if Steve Race had been working for Sega. I don't think he'd have allowed it. He was more of a grassroots kind of guy. Like he was, that where they put like a bunch of Genesis in a shopping mall and just let kids play them. Like just a totally different marketing style. And it cannot be overstated. Like, what an impact that had on them, because I think it just kind of like took the wind out of their sails. They had to pivot, and they went with a different marketing firm, and the marketing. Yeah, I laugh at it nowadays, and I kind of find it charming in a weird way. But boy, was it ineffective, at actually selling the Sega Saturn. So, and even Tom, like, I feel so bad for Tom being up on that stage, having to like talk about rods and cones, and having to try to convince everybody that this train wreck of a commercial is actually like a good idea, but anyway, so yeah, they really shouldn't have let Steve Race go. Kind of like in baseball, you just pay him whatever he's asking for. He's the reason why you guys are doing so well,
But they lost Steve Race, and they lost Al Nilsson.
They lost Al Nilsson
just the year before as well. So that was like the team that basically were behind the strategy and the marketing ethos at Sega in America were gone overnight pretty much.
Yeah, they gave Sega its kind of attitude, its personality in the West, and Kolinsky, he kind of oversaw the larger big picture stuff, like packing in Sonic and stuff like that. But I think he gets a lot more credit, and those guys go kind of unsung. Like, people don't really talk about them, but they should, because that's kind of, they don't realize. Just like everybody says, oh, Yuji Naka, he made Sonic. But I mean, like, what about all the other folks like that rarely get talked about that actually are responsible for so much more, It's kind of like that. Anyway, I digress. This has been a fun chat. I think we should wrap it up here. It's 11 o'clock my time. I don't know what it is your time, but I'm sure it's late. What, 2?
Yeah,
2 Yeah, it's 7 in the morning. It's 7 in the morning here now. I'm in the hotel, so they're just getting the breakfast carts ready. So I know where I'm going after this.
Oh man, I always appreciate when you show up, man. I know that's got to be tough.
Yeah,
I love it.
Definitely.
It's always a pleasure. Love it.
Anyway, it was so good talking to you guys. Thanks for joining me, and until next time, it's been SaturnDave and the MegaDriver and Sega Lord X reminding you that you must play Sega Saturn and play all the Sega consoles while we're at it. We love Sega. We're okay recommending that. And until next time, we'll catch you later. See ya.
Storm, shoot!